Section 26 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 17. The sight of his brother's corpse seemed to steady Inglesant's nerves and clear his brain. He turned to the host and said, "What way can the murderer have escaped?" The host shook his head. He was incapable of speech or even thought. The three men stood looking at each other without a word. Then Inglesant knelt down by the body and raised the head. There was no doubt that life was extinct. Indeed, the body must have been nearly drained of blood. The fine line of steel had done its work fully and with no loss of time. Inglesant rose from the ground. His sight, his recollection, his senses were speedily failing him. Nothing kept him conscious but the terrible shock acting with galvanic effect upon his frame. The back of the premises was searched, and mounted messengers were sent to the neighbouring towns and to the crossroads, and notice sent to the nearest justice of the peace. The country rose in great numbers and came pouring in to Minturn before the early evening set in. The body was deposited on the long table in the parlour where the deed was committed, and more than one justice examined the room that afternoon. Inglesant saw that the guard was set and proper care taken, and then he mounted to ride to Oulton. He was not fit to ride, but to stay in the house all night was impossible, to lie down equally so. In the night air he rode to Oulton, through the long wild chase, by the pools of water, from which the flocks of birds rose startled as he passed, and by the herds of deer. The ride settled his nerves, and when he reached the house he was still master of himself. The news had preceded him. Lady Cardiff was said to be in a paroxysm of grief, but as no one had seen her for days except her immediate servants, Inglesant did not attempt to obtain an interview with her. He was received by Dr. Moore and the superior servants, and sat down to supper. Not a word was spoken during that sombre meal, except by the doctor, who pressed Inglesant to eat and drink, and offered to introduce him to Van Helmont, who was not present. The doctor said grace after supper, but when he had done, one of the female servants, a Quakeress, stood up and spoke some words recommending patience and a feeling after God, if perchance he might be found to be present, and a help in such a terrible need. The singularity of this proceeding roused Inglesant from the lethargy in which he was, and the words seemed to strike upon his heart with a familiar and not uncongenial sense. The mystical doctrine which he had studied was not unlike much that he would hear from Quaker lips. He went to his room after supper, intending to rise early next morning, but before daybreak he was delirious and in a high fever, and Van Helmont was sent for to his room, and bled him freely, and administered cordials and narcotic draughts. The skilful treatment caused him to sleep quietly for many hours, and when he awoke, though prostrate with weakness, he was free from fever, and his brain was calm and clear. From inquiries which he made, it appeared that the Italian had been making preparations for leaving for several days, probably doubting the success of his attempt to win over Eustace to tolerate his continued stay at Oulton. Inglesant was told that it was supposed that he had not intended to murder his brother, but that Eustace had probably threatened him, and that in the heat of contention the blow was struck. The Italian had destroyed all his papers and everything that could give any clue to his conduct or history, but he had left a very bad reputation behind him, independently of his last murderous act, and his influence with Lady Cardiff was attributed to witchcraft. The funeral of Eustace Inglesant took place a few days after at the church on the borders of the chase. Snow had fallen in the meanwhile, and the train of black mourners passed over the waste of white that covered the park. A multitude of people filled the churchyard and crowded round the outside of the hall. Lady Cardiff, by lavish almsgiving and other vagaries, had always attracted a number of vagrant and masterless people to Oulton, and there were always some encampments of such people in the chase. She particularly favoured mountebanks and quacks of all kinds, and numbers of them were present at the funeral. Some few of the country gentry attended, but Eustace being almost unknown in the country, and his wife by no means popular, many who otherwise would have been present were not so. The Puritan authorities of the neighbourhood suspected Lady Cardiff's establishments as a haunt of recusants. Dr. Moore was a known royalist. Eustace had been only restrained from active exertion on the same side by his love of pleasure and his wife's prudence, and the Puritans regarded the Quakers with no favour. The herd of idle and vicious people, as the authorities considered them, who frequented Oulton, was an abomination in their eyes, and understanding that a number of them would be at the funeral, 2 or 3 Puritan magistrates with armed servants and constables assembled to keep order, as they said, but as it proved to provoke a riot. To make matters worse, Dr. Moore began to read the prayer book service, which was forbidden by law. The justices interposed. The mob of mountebanks and players and idle people sided with the church party, which had always given them a friendly toleration, and commenced an assault upon the constables and justices' servants, driving them from the graveside with a storm of snowballs. The funeral was completed with great haste, and the mourning party returned to the house, whither the mob also resorted, and were regaled with provisions of all kinds during the afternoon, being with difficulty induced to disperse at night. Inglesant took no part in this rite, being indeed still too weak and ill to exert himself at all. He expected to be arrested and sent back to London, but the authorities did not take much notice of the riot, contenting themselves with dispersing the people and seeing that most of them left the neighbourhood, which they were induced to do by being set in the village stocks and otherwise imprisoned and intimidated. Lady Cardiff had sent messages to Inglesant every day, expressing her interest in him, and she now sent Van Helmont to him with the information that a large sum of money, which he had signed to his brother, would now be his. This sum, which amounted to several £1,000s, she was ready to pay over to Inglesant whenever he might desire it. She hoped he would remain at Oulton till his health was more established, but she hinted that she thought it was for his own interest that neither his stay there nor indeed in England should be unnecessarily prolonged. Meanwhile she recommended him to Dr. Moore and to the Quakers. The teaching which he would derive from both sources, she assured him, would be much to his benefit. Inglesant returned a courteous message expressive of his obligation for her extraordinary generosity, and assuring her that he should endeavour to benefit by whatever her inmates might communicate to him. He informed her that he intended, as soon as his strength was sufficiently established, to go to Paris, where the only friend he had left was, and that any sum of money she was so generous as to afford him might be transmitted to the merchants there. He had some thoughts, he said, of going to Gidding, but had learnt that soon after the execution of the king the house had been attacked by a mob of soldiers and others, and that the family, who had timely warning of their intention, had left the neighbourhood and were dispersed. He concluded by hoping that before he left he might be allowed to thank his benefactress in person. Some weeks passed over at Oulton with great tranquillity, and Inglesant regained his strength and calmness of mind. There was a large and valuable library in the house, and the society of Dr. Moore was pleasant to Inglesant, though in many ways they were far from congenial. Indeed, there was more in Van Helmont's character and taste that suited his tone of mind. During these weeks, however, Inglesant began to adapt himself to a course of religious life from which he never altogether departed, and which, after some doubts and many attempts on the part of others to divert him from it, he followed to the end of his life. He was no doubt strengthened at the beginning of this course by the conversation of Dr. Moore, and also of the Quakers. These latter, whom Inglesant had been led to regard with aversion, he found harmless and sober people, whose blameless lives and the elevated mysticism of their conversation commended them to him. The transient calm of this existence was, however, broken by one absorbing idea, the desire of being revenged upon his brother's murderer, of tracking the Italian's path and bringing him to some terrible justice. It was this that induced him to seek the Jesuit, whom at one time he had been inclined to shun. No one, he considered, would have it in his power, from the innumerable agents in every country with whom he had connection, to assist him in his search so much as the Jesuit, and he believed that he had deserved as much at his master's hand. But it was not natural that, at any rate at once, he should suppose that such a motive as this would be any hindrance to him in a religious life, and for a long time he was unconscious of any such idea. It will be as well here to endeavour to understand something of the peculiar form which Christianity had assumed in Inglesant's mind, a form which was not peculiar to himself, but which he possessed in common with most in that day whose training had been more or less similar to his own. It was similar in many respects to that which prevails in the present day in most Roman Catholic countries, and may be described as Christianity without the Bible. It is doubtful whether, except perhaps once or twice in college chapel, he had ever read a chapter of the Bible himself in his life. Certainly he never possessed a Bible himself. Of its contents, excepting those portions which are read in church and those contained in the prayer book, he was profoundly ignorant. It was not included in the course of studies set him by the Jesuit. Of the Protestant doctrines of justification by faith and by the blood of Christ, and of the Calvinistic ones of predestination and assurance, he was only acquainted in a vague and general way, as he might have heard mention of them in idle talk, mostly in contempt and dislike. It is true that Laudian school in the church in which he had been brought up held doctrines which in outward terms might seem to bear some affinity with some, if not all, of these, but they were in reality very different. The Laudian school held indeed that the sacrifice of Christ's blood had removed the guilt of sin, and that by that, and that only, was salvation secured to men. But they held that this had been accomplished on the cross once for all, independently of anything that man could or do or leave undone. The very slightest recognition on the part of man of this divine sacrifice, the very least submission to the church ordinances, combined with freedom from outward sin, was sufficient to secure salvation to the baptized, and indeed the church regarded with leniency and hope even the wild and reprobate. It is true that the Laudian press teemed with holy work, setting the highest of pure standards before its readers and exhorting to the following of a holy life. But this life was looked upon rather as a spiritual luxury and privilege to which high and refined natures might well endeavour to attain, rather than as absolutely necessary to salvation. With this view the Church regarded human error with tolerance, and amusements and enjoyments with approbation, and as deserving the highest sanctions of religion. Inglesant's Christianity, therefore, was ignorant of doctrine and dogma of almost every kind, and concentrated itself altogether on what may be called the idea of Christ, that is, a lively conception of and attraction to the person of the Saviour. This idea, which comes to men in different ways, and which came to Inglesant for the first time in the sacrament at Gidding, being, I should suppose, a purely intellectual one, would no doubt be inefficient and transitory, were it not for the unique and mysterious power of attraction which it undoubtedly possesses. In the pursuit of this idea he received little assistance from Dr. Moore. The school to which the doctor belonged, the Christian Platonists, had no tendency to that exclusive worship of the person of Jesus which in some religious schools has almost superseded the worship of God. This he had received from the Jesuits and the mystical books of Catholic devotion which had had so great an influence over him. The Jesuits, with all their faults, held fast by the motive of their founder, and the worship of Jesus was by them carried to its fullest extent. Dr. Moore's theology was more that of a philosophical deism, into which the person and attributes of Christ entered as a part of an universal scheme in which the universe, mankind, and all-pervading Spirit of God, and the objects of thought and sense, play distinct and conspicuous parts. One fine and warm day in the early spring, Inglesant and the doctor were walking in the garden at the side of the house, bordering on the chase and park. The wide expanse of grassy upland stretched before them. Overhead the arch of heaven, checkered by the white clouds, was full of life and light and motion. Across the water of the lakes the church bells rung for amusement by the village lads came to the ear, softened and yet enriched in tone. The spring air, fanned by a fresh breeze, refreshed the spirits and the sense. The doctor began, as upon a favourite theme, to speak of his great sense of the power and benefit of the fresh air. "I would always," he said, "be sub dio, if it were possible. Is there anything more delicious to the touch than the soft, cool air, playing on our heated temples, recruiting and refrigerating the spirits and the blood? I could read, discourse, or think nowhere as well as in some arbour, where the cool air rustles through the moving leaves. And what a rapture of mind does such a scene as this always inspire within me! to a free and divine spirit. How lovely, how magnificent is this state for the soul of man to be in, when the life of God inactuating her, she travels through heaven and earth, and unites with, and after a sort feels herself the life and soul of this whole world, even as God. This indeed is to become deiform, not by imagination, but by union of life. God doth not ride me whither I know not, but discourseth with me as a friend, and speaks to me in such a dialect as I can understand fully, namely the outward world of his creatures, so that I am in fact in cola caeli in terra, an inhabitant of paradise and heaven upon earth. And I may soberly confess that sometimes walking abroad after my studies, I've been almost mad with pleasure, the effect of nature upon my soul having been inexpressibly ravishing, and beyond what I can convey to you. Inglesant said that such a state of mind was most blessed and much to be desired, but that few could hope to attain to it, and to many it would seem a fantastic enthusiasm. No, said the doctor, I'm not out of my wits, as some may fondly interpret me, in this divine freedom, but the love of God compelleth me, and though you yourself know the extent of fancy, when phantoms seem real external objects, yet here the principle of my opponents, the Quakers, who, it may be, are nearer to the purity of Christianity for the life and power of it than many others, is the most safe and reasonable to keep close to the light within a man. You agree with the Quakers, then, in some points, said Inglesant. They have indeed many excellent points, and very nobly Christian, which I wish they would disencumber from such things as make them seem so uncouth and ridiculous. But the reason Our Lady has taken so to them as to change some of her servants for Quakers, and to design to change more, is that they prove lovers of quiet and retirement, and they fit the circumstances that she is in, that cannot endure any noise better than others, for the weight of her affliction lies so heavy upon her, that it is incredible how very seldom she can endure any one in her chamber, and she finds them so still, quiet, and serious, that their company is very acceptable to her, and she is refreshed by the accounts of their trials and consolations, and their patience and support under great distress. Baron Van Helmont frequents their meetings. What do you think of the Baron? I think he knows as little of himself truly and really as one who had never seen him in his life. Inglesant did not try to penetrate into this oracular response, but said, Have you seen Mr. Fox, the famous Quaker? Yes, I saw him once, replied the doctor, and in conversation with him I felt myself, as it were, turned into brass, so much did his spirit and perversity oppress mine. There are some men, the doctor went on after a pause, but Inglesant did not know of whom he was thinking, that by a divine sort of fate are virtuous and good, and this to a very great and heroical degree, and come into the world rather for the good of others, and by a divine force, than through their own proper fault, or any immediate or necessary congruity of their natures. All which is agreeable to that opinion of Plato, that some descend hither to declare the being and nature of the gods, and for the greater health, purity, and perfection of this lower world. I would fain believe, Mr. Inglesant, he continued to the other's great surprise, that you are one of those. Ever since I first saw you I have had some thought of this, and the more I see of you, the more I hope and believe that some such work as this is reserved for you. You have what is very happy for you, what I call an ethereal sort of body, to use the Pythagorean phrase, even in this life of mighty purity and plenty of the animal spirits which you may keep lucid by that conduct and piety by which you may govern yourself. And this makes it all the more incumbent on you to have a great care to keep in order this luciform vehicle of the soul, as the Platonists call it. For there is a sanctity of body which the sensually minded do not so much as dream of, and this divine body should be cultivated as well as the divine life, for by how much any person partakes more of righteousness and virtue, he hath also a greater measure of this divine body or celestial matter within himself. He throws off the baser affections of the earthly body, and replenishes his inner man with so much larger draughts of ethereal or celestial matter. And to incite you still more to this effort, you have only to consider that the oracle of God is not to be heard but in his holy temple, that is to say, in a good and holy man, thoroughly sanctified in spirit, soul, and body. End of section 26.